If you prefer to read instead of listen, a link is in the description. You know, I can't believe I didn't think of doing an episode of the Baldur's Gate trilogy sooner, given I am a big fan. And I use the word trilogy loosely here, as I am covering the original game, the sequel Shadows of Amn, and the sequel's expansion Throne of Bal. That's technically 2.5 games, but it does convey the story in 3 distinct sections, so it sort of feels like a trilogy. It might be more accurate to refer to this instead as the Bhaalspawn saga. Anyway, I am getting a little ahead of myself. Welcome to A Writer's Perspective. And this is an episode focusing on my perspective on the writing for Baldur's Gate. Hello again. If you are new here, this is where I, a lizard robot who pretends she can write, rambles on about my thoughts on the writing of various media. Usually I focus on games rather than books, because I think a good writer learns lessons from every medium. Before we get properly started, 2 things. 1. I apologize for all the incorrect pronunciation that my text-to-speech device will make. 2. I will push on with as many spoilers as I please. Now, the setup. Baldur's Gate begins with an orphan, your character, who is the ward of a wizard named Gorion. The early stages involve preparing for a journey with the old man, but that kind of gets cut short when Gorion is cut down by a man in ominous and far too spiky armor. From there, it becomes a zero-to-hero narrative of various smaller tasks and adventures, but all wound together by the goal of finding the person who killed Gorion. You make friends, enemies, and other things along the way. Eventually, it is revealed that the killer is named Saravuk. He has a plan to start a war as a sacrifice that will allow him to ascend to godhood. See, he is a Bhaalspawn, a child of the dead god of murder Bal. And he thinks an old prophecy about the dead god's children refers to him. It is also revealed that your character is also a Bhaalspawn. This revelation colors and informs almost everything that follows in the sequel and its expansion, and is why the story as a whole is sometimes called the Bhaalspawn saga. The sequel opens with you and the canonical allies you brought with you to the end of the original locked in cages by a new villain. An evil wizard named Irenicus with a keen interest in your divine parentage and power. A mysterious group is attacking said wizard's dungeon, which you use as an opportunity to bust out. But you find you've lost some good people from the first game to the wizard's experiments, and your companions are not happy about it. And it gets worse when you finally get out and, because of local laws and circumstances, the wizard is locked up along with Imoen, fellow orphan and childhood friend from the first game that has been framed as a sort of sister figure to your character. What comes after shifts from getting enough money to sail to the magical prison of Spellhold to get Imoen back, or get revenge on Irenicus, to chasing the wizard down to get your and Imoen's souls that the wizard stole. The chase and conflict all ends in hell itself, where you and your allies do battle with Irenicus for your divinity and soul after being forced to face trials of character and choice. In the end, you retrieve the stolen divine souls, and the story makes a shift to the final part of the saga, Throne of Bal. The final part of the saga sees the Bhaalspawn thrust into a new region and taking out the armies of the five powerful Bhaalspawn. But there is another villain to worry about, one that is manipulating things behind the scenes. The conflict here is the apex of the saga, with the question of what to do with the dead god's divinity being answered at last. Taken together, they form a story that sees an orphan who is nothing special becoming one of the most powerful figures in a fantasy setting, a threat to archwizards, supreme warriors, and even servants of the gods. It is an epic, sprawling narrative with a few interesting twists and a sense of momentum that can keep you going. It also has a number of smaller stories that play out in the shadow of the bigger one, lesser conflicts and concerns that don't have a direct tie to the main plot but can present a compelling thing to pursue the narrative of. Now, let's dive into my thoughts on the writing. The writing style of the games is very dialogue-driven, but there is incidental prose for various events, whether it is describing a vampire's severed hand to the history of a magical item or the contents of one of the many books you can read for lore. These are all great for immersing into the world, building a sense of a living, breathing world. That the story of the Bhaalspawn saga is just one of many stories playing out. This incidental writing isn't bad, but it isn't particularly good either. It is functional and serves the purpose of constructing an image in the mind or providing lore, but there's nothing there that's spectacular or memorable. No clever turns of phrase or descriptions that stick in the mind long after you read it. With that in mind, what is the plot like? Is it any good? The plot of the Ballspawn saga isn't stellar, but it is functional. A huge part of the narrative, particularly from the second game onward, is about tackling the legacy of Ball. The first game is more of an open adventure with an emerging end goal, but it isn't the strongest part of the overall narrative. For me, the real strength of the plot shines in the impact that the late revelations of the first game have on the character. Whether it is the consequences that come from having a divine soul others are eager to exploit for themselves, or the personal aspect of coming to terms with that and facing that legacy, making it your own or rejecting it. In terms of pure technical or prose achievement, it fails to stand out, but the necessary framework for a good story is there. There are smaller stories to consider, of course. A number of the side quests in the game are actually pretty good. There are good character moments, though ones that are very small and barely a blip compared to the rest of the game. Still, the game does a good job in building the sense of desperation in Trademeat because it is besieged by angry druids and animals, or the pettiness of a red dragon using your character as a proxy for revenge on your adoptive father. Side quests in these games make for good stories, easily digestible but delivering a decent arc and evoking a variety of moods and images. The real gold of the writing of the Ballspawn saga isn't in the plot elements or the twists thereof. Rather, it was in the writing of the characters. The games have some of the most memorable characters of the time, each one with clear personalities and quirks. For the ones that appeared in playable form throughout the saga, most of them saw considerable development and building of depth. Baldur's Gate character tended to be a bit flat, more a collection of characteristics than being real characters. However, the writing of these is strong enough to make those traits shine and be memorable. That game leaned more towards having more characters to choose from rather than a smaller roster with higher quality character work. An exception to this is in the main villain of the game, Saravik Anchaf. Saravik is well developed and well characterized, always imposing and monstrous but also charismatic and likable in that particular way that villains sometimes are. Despite being comparatively flat, or perhaps because of it, some of the best characters in that first game are strongly memorable. From the selfing Viconia to the endearing but annoying pseudo-sibling Imoen, the stern and unflinching but kind Jaehaira to the lovable and dense pair of Minsk and Bu, the first game makes excellent use of flat characters. Given that a flat character is meant to achieve the same effect each time they appear, the cast from that game is incredibly consistent and well used. And the quality of their writing makes them memorable, even if they were one-note figures. The sequel also plays the whole thing about you being a child of a dead god for all it's worth, as well. At key points in the game, that divine parentage comes up in dreams that explore just what that means. The prose descriptions and writing of these instances get the point across well enough, and sometimes they can even be quite chilling. These moments are usually dreams and they feel much more transgressive and personal in highlighting the consequences of what being a child of Ball means. Where the character writing really shines is in the sequels moving forward. There are fewer characters, but they are all much more developed. They have their own quirks, their own histories, their own voices. The introduction of party banter, where characters in the party talk to each other instead of just interjecting in predetermined plot moments, also adds depth. It provides a window into their dynamics and interests, lets us glimpse how they see each other and provides insight into who they are. Sometimes the conversations can turn violent due to very strong disagreements, while some pairs of characters can actually have surprisingly positive interactions with each other because of some unexpected common ground. These quirks sometimes end up being put to good use in helping evoke the right feel for a given moment. An example of this occurs late into the second game, when the party finds itself dragged to the Nine Hells to face Irenicus in one final battle, as well as test the Ballspawn's soul and resolve. One possible party member here is Jan Jansen, who never seems to lack an anecdote that a situation reminds him of. Until that exact moment, where the gravity of the moment has left him as close to speechless as one can get with January. Another interesting bit about the characters in Shadows of AMN are the personal quests. Most of the characters get an event that pops up while they travel with you, and these flesh out their stories and give insight into who they were before they met you. Sometimes the stories are far from kind to them, while others offer them an opportunity to correct past mistakes with your assistance and nudging. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the truly exemplary writing of the villain of Shadows of AMN, the wizard Irenicus. A chilling, effective, and terrifying villain, Irenicus is easily the most strongly written antagonist in the series. His cold demeanor, a backstory, an introduction that highlights how cruel and monstrous he can be, and some clever moments come together to create a memorable villain that amateur writers should study to improve the creation of their villains. I have a particular fondness for his no-nonsense attitude and dismissing the typical heroic attempt to find out what he wants with a simple "you warrant no villain's" exposition from me. That lesser villains around him aren't up to the same standard of intelligence and competence is arguably the only reason the party had a shot at beating him. The villain writing in Throne of Ball, alongside the plot writing, feels weaker than before. The expansion is much more condensed than it needs to be, and has a feeling of rushing you through the narrative and the confrontations with the Five and the deranged mastermind pulling their strings. As such, they feel flatter than Saravik or Irenicus were, their demeanors as villains far less compelling and their presence not as intimidating or memorable. Actually, the writing in Throne of Ball takes a nosedive. The character work is still at a decent standard, and the reintroduced Saravik is explored really well given the limited narrative time available. However, the plot itself feels shallower, little more than an excuse to go through dungeon crawl to dungeon crawl. It is a huge step down from the superior work in Shadows of AMN, and the character moments and interjections are essentially the only thing that gives it any sense of narrative weight. I should also mention what I consider to be a serious weakness of the overall narrative flow of Shadows of AMN. At a certain point in the game, Irenicus succeeds in stripping both the Ballspawn and Imoen of their souls, and it's repeatedly pointed out this is fatal. That these characters are living on borrowed time unless they get them back. And while this should feel like it increases the stakes, it never has any narrative weight because apart from those warnings, there is no indication that taking time to get through the game is detrimental. The warnings and the dangers of having no soul are never given a sense of urgency besides telling you it's urgent. The closest thing the game does to showing you the consequences and instilling that urgency is the Slayer form. And even that is something that you learn to unleash on command after the first few instances, making it ineffective at convincing you to move along and get your stolen soul back. Now, I would be remiss if I did not include my thoughts on the new characters and writing done for the enhanced editions. For the unaware, these newer versions added a few new characters and new material to read through. Unfortunately, a lot of it is out of place. The prose style of the content for the enhanced editions is distinct from what's already been written, and while it is comparable in terms of technical proficiency, it falls flat in practice. They're not bad, but they feel less polished, less evocative than the older material. At some points, the newer stuff also feels considerably more amateurish or formulaic, written to meet some particular requirements rather than because that's what the story called for. The new party members are also very out of place, not because they're not lore compliant but because the writing would like it if they were seen as better than the older characters. The problem is that the attempts to show that superiority come across as clumsy and ham-fisted. An egregious example is in the kidnapping scene late into Shadows of AMN that happens to all the romance options if the relationship has progressed far enough. Sure, it was bad writing to have those options suddenly lose all competence and get themselves kidnapped and turned into vampires by one of the villains, but it was consistent. The enhanced edition additional characters all avoid this, sometimes in contrived ways, and it feels more like the creators of the new characters want to one-up the older, more established ones. These problems also extend to essentially the entirety of the made much later middle edition, Siege of Dragonspear. Designed to fill the gap between the original and Shadows of AMN, This game has all of the writing problems of the new enhanced edition materials but has little to none of the strengths of the original games. Everything about the characters, plot, and writing feels duller, less polished. Even stalwart comedic goofball Minsk feels like an empty shell compared to previous outings, and he never had much depth to begin with. Overall, there is a lot to love about the Ballspawn saga. It has some great, memorable characters. The first game really hones in on that sense of adventure, while the sequel ups the stakes with an incredible, effective antagonist and the unraveling of his schemes. Throne of Ball is weak, but it does provide closure to the character arc that began with the first game. But it isn't without flaws. There are glaring weaknesses and problems, and not all of them can be excused as being a concession required by the video game medium. The final verdict here is that there is some memorable use of flat characters and efforts in fleshing out more compelling ones. And when it's good, and captures that Dungeons and Dragons magic. And the flawed writing doesn't always take away from all that. There are better written games of this type out there, particularly more modern games, but the writing of those games is clearly built on the foundation laid by Baldur's Gate.